From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hi, I'm Mark Horowitz from the Music Division, and it's my pleasure to be able to welcome you today. I'm going to do a brief introduction to Nigel Simeone, the editor of the Leonard Bernstein Letters. There's a program out there that gives you his bio, but briefly, Nigel spent several years in music publishing as a music antiquarian. He taught high school and at several universities, Nottingham, Bangor, and Sheffield. And he's a prolific author. His books include Leonard Bernstein, West Side Story, which he researched also at the library, Paris, a Musical Gazetteer, Janacek's works, and a number of books on Messiaen, including a full-length biography and a catalog of works. He's a regular lecturer and broadcaster, and he writes for the monthly magazine International Record Review. And he's getting ready to do a next book, a biography of the conductor Charles Mackerras. Sorry. So that's the technical stuff. Now the more fun stuff. Nigel has been working, apparently the first time he came to the library was in 1983, long before I started working here. But I've known Nigel now for several years. And a lot of it spent working in the Bernstein collection, and it was while working on the West Side Story book that he got the notion for doing this one. I should tell you, the Bernstein collection is one of the most remarkable in the music division for many reasons, and the personal correspondence in the collection, as opposed to the fan mail and the business correspondence, is over 17,000 letters. So Nigel had to do a lot of reading and selecting to get to the ones in this book, but he did a wonderful job. I've heard rumors there might be a second volume, we'll see. And it's also worth noting that not all the letters in the book are from the Bernstein collection, because letters that Lenny wrote to other people ended up among their papers, but we're also blessed that many of those collections are also in the music division, including Copland, David Diamond, Kusevitsky, Lucas Foss. So it's sort of a nice simpatico that way. And for the first time that I'm aware of, because of this project and Nigel's research in tracking down where all these Bernstein letters were that he wrote to other people, we've actually gotten 2 new collections to the music division because he tracked down those estates, and those people decided that they wanted their papers to come to us, including their letters from Lenny. And that's David Oppenheim and Bernstein's childhood friend Mildred Spiegel Zucker. So it's a very nice simpatico there. I just want to say it's, for those of us who work on these special collections, you can sometimes spend a year, or in the case of Bernstein collection, many years working on a collection, and there are a few things more gratifying than seeing them turn into something that becomes meaningful and that the public at large gets to see and know. So this is a particular pleasure for us. And we're not supposed to have favorite researchers, but I won't say it anymore. There are examples there are actual letters from Bernstein for you to look at after the talk. There are copies of the book for purchase. Nigel will be signing them here afterwards. So have a wonderful time. Thank you. Welcome, Nigel.
Thank you all very much. This is a tremendous pleasure and a tremendous honor. It's a tremendous honor to be in the Library of Congress, but it's a real pleasure to be talking about Bernstein and his correspondence in the place where it all lives. One thing I'm going to try and do today is to show you something that the book can't show you, which is what these letters actually physically look like. Now, Mark has done a fantastic job over there with some of them, and I've got a lot more on slides. So if you do want to move a little closer now, please don't be afraid. There are a lot of pictures, and some of the writing is pretty terrible. It's all right, it's not a test, I've done that bit, but even so, you'll probably want to see them. I've called it 10,000 Intimate Friends because that's actually a quote from Bernstein himself. If you've read the wonderful book by Jonathan Cott called Dinner with Lenny, which was an extraordinary 8-hour interview with plenty of wine and food to make it flow, this is what Lenny said: you need love, and that's why I have 10,000 intimate friends. And you get that impression, rather, looking at this gigantic correspondence. I've rather loosely been saying to people that there's 15,000 or so letters, and it's rather reassuring to discover from what Mark just said that I was actually not exaggerating and that it's more like 17,000. It is a monstrous collection in terms of scope, and of course that doesn't include all the letters from Bernstein. And what I tried to do in this book was to mix them up as much as possible, and where it was actually possible to match up letters with their replies, especially with really extensive correspondence like the wonderful letters between Bernstein and Copland, most of which had not been seen before, and the tremendous ones with David Oppenheim, who Mark just mentioned, whose stuff came through just in time to include it. I'll show you some of those as well. Okay, let's begin at the beginning, a few weeks before Bernstein's 15th birthday, in fact. This is a letter to his friend Sid Ramin, who later on, of course, went on to orchestrate West Side Story, and who is still alive and living in New York City. And Lenny and Sid were born a few months apart and shared an absolute raging passion for music. But what I love about this letter is that you find, even when he was 14 years old, that Bernstein can't resist writing a letter with a slight sense of theater about it. If you look at the bottom of the page, he says that he's got much more important news, and then teases him by saying, "Turn over and see," and here's what the news was. Now, you will understand that I'm thrilled to show you this because, of course, on the printed page in cold, hard type, it doesn't look like that. There's a kind of wonderful exuberance about these early letters. It's just absolutely enchanting, but it even happens in terms of the, the sort of style of the writing, the size of the letters and all the rest of it. I'm just going to read you a tiny bit from the end of the same letter. He got a piano version of it, a solo piano version of it to play, I should say. And he says, of course, it doesn't come up to the way the orchestra plays it, but it's marvelous anyway. And the ending, speaking of cacophony, boom, crash, discord, sock, brrr, down the scale. Well, now that I've got that off my chest, I feel better. Now, this kind of energy and passion for all things musical, all new discoveries that he made, is one side to the letters from very early on. But so is a certain eagerness to please those who cared about him and who supported him. And one of those people was Helen Coates, who was at the time his piano teacher, who of course became his devoted secretary for decades. But she was still his very much a piano teacher when Lenny sent her this letter, giving her the results of his exams, and basically telling her that he was going to get into Harvard because he got the highest mark in the school for English. You can see the results: 90% in French, even 70% in physics, for heaven's sake. And the surprise is that he wasn't very good at history when he was at Boston Latin School. A mere 60%, which by his standards was okay. But there's a delightful sort of pride in what he'd achieved here, and he obviously wanted to share that with Helen Coates. She had supported him hugely and taken him under her wing. It's worth mentioning, actually, the very first letter in the book is the letter that Lenny wrote to her arranging his own piano lessons, because such was the, well, if not hostility, certainly apathy from Bernstein's dad about a musical education, that he left it to his firstborn son to fix his own lessons, which is an extraordinary thing to expect somebody at the age of 13 to do. As we see from this letter, he was about to get into Harvard. Now, Lenny left us with a very rosy picture of his time at Harvard, and of course, like everybody, looked back on his college years as, you know, potentially the best of his life and all that. Interesting then that in December 1938, he wrote to his friend Kenneth Ehrman saying, "I hate the Harvard music department. You can quote that. You can even print it if you want. I hate it because it is stupid and high schoolish and disciplinary and prim and foolish and academic and stolid and fussy. I want to go home. Toujours Bernstein." Which gives us rather a different gloss. The reason, above all, was because by then he had met Copland, who he felt was somebody who could be a real mentor to him. He said, for instance, in that same letter about Harvard, he said, "Walter Piston doubts me, but Copland encourages me." So, for instance, it was to Copland that he wrote a couple of weeks before that letter, middle of November 1938, about his thesis. He was going to write a thesis on the subject of nationalism in American music. But the fantastic thing about this is that he hardly knew any at this point. Here's what he says to Copland. "This is where you can help," he says. "What music of what other composers in America would support my points, and where can I get hold of it? Would the music of Roy Harris, or Ives, or William Schumann, or Piston? You see, I know and hear so little American stuff. This is my great opportunity to get to know it well." I love the idea of Leonard Bernstein being somebody who at that point hardly knew any American music. It's almost inconceivable. I'd sort of imagine that he'd been weaned on this stuff. But really, here he was a couple of years into his time at Harvard, and he didn't know much at all, apart, of course, from the music of Copland. And that is a wonderful image of him at about the time, actually a year before, he met Copland, playing his great Copland party piece, which was the piano variations. I can sort of imagine him doing that in a photo like that. Okay, here is one of the many marvelous letters to Copland. I'm going to show you a few of them in the course of this talk because I think they're some of the best. This is just the start of an incredibly long rant. "God damn it, Aaron. Why practice Chopin mazurkas? Why practice even the Copland variations? The week has made me so sick, Aaron, that I can't breathe anymore. The whole superfluousness of art shows up at a time like this, and the whole futility of spending your life in it, and so on and so on." You can see what he's going on about. What really annoyed him was that he went to a program of contemporary music, including the Copland variations, what he described as the climax of his week. And it was a program that included Malipiero and Kodai and Hindemith and, joy of joys, the Copland variations. That, I guess, was the premiere in Boston. Well, to get to the point, I don't know whether you knew it was going to be played here, but if you did, how did you allow it? In short, she gave really no performance at all. I can stand a bad performance, but not no performance. She began the thing wrong, played about 2 measures, skipped some variations, got lost again, skipped about 5 pages, played a few measures out of tempo, entirely without any discernment, without any idea of rhythm, and kept this up, playing little measures from choice variations until she reached the coda. Then she played about half of that and called it a day. I was purple. I wish I could let you know how incredibly bad it was. It was the work of an imbecile. I left then and broke dishes in the Georgian cafeteria, and so on. Now, one of the things that marks out every aspect of the Copland-Bernstein correspondence is its fabulous honesty to one another about what they were experiencing, like that concert, but also about each other's music, and we'll see some examples of that. But first of all, this is a charming letter, lower left. It's very hard to read, but this is where it was his first summer in New York City in 1939, Bernstein's first summer that he spent there. Hated it for the most part. Thought it was full of wild people who just wanted to spend their time frittering away their lives at the Village Vanguard and being sociable. Thought it was dreadful. Den of iniquity, full of gays. He hated it. Really, it's a wonderful letter to Ken Ehrman again, where he says all of this and more, and you just can't believe you're reading this. But he was actually, I think, a bit sort of Bostonian and priggish about New York City at this time, and it certainly reads that way. However, what he did do was get close to Copland and sent him some of his music. And here you have him announcing that he's finished the piano transcription of El Salón Mexico, which was Bernstein's first publication, actually, was making that arrangement for Copland. And then, a little later on, halfway down the letter, under separate cover, as they say, I'm sending the Lamentation. Now, that, of course, is from what became the Jeremiah Symphony a couple of years later. And he was really urging Copland to tell him what he thought of it. And Copland replied very touchingly, saying, well, I've got a lot to say, but I'm not going to put any of it in a letter, because this sort of thing needs to be done face to face. I think that's actually very sweet. He didn't want to, and didn't ever, I think, send Bernstein a sort of hurtful letter at all. There are some robustly honest ones between both of them. But I don't think either of them ever wrote nasty letters to each other. And I think if Copland had something really quite critical to say about one of Bernstein's pieces, it was done face-to-face in private. What's rather charming about the Lamentation is that this is a movement Copland himself actually conducted 40 years later at Bernstein's birthday concert here in DC in 1978 with, I think, Christa Ludwig singing it. So there's a lovely long history. Just above that is a couple of Copland cartoons that Bernstein drew on the bottom of the first page of the autographed manuscript of El Salón Mexico, which he either added the 1943 one later, or he was just inventing a chronology here about how Copland was going to, how his ears were going to grow even bigger, evidently, between 1936 and 1943. That manuscript, by the way, you can look at it online anytime. It's in the Juilliard collection, and it's very, very wonderful. Now, Bernstein had quite a lot of girlfriends. Mildred Spiegel was certainly one of them. Beatrice Gordon was another. He used to write adoring poetry to her. And Shirley Gabis was yet another, now Shirley Pearl. And he wrote her quite a few tremendous letters. This one was written on a train and is a typical example of Bernstein playing endlessly with words. He couldn't resist it. I think he was a wonderful correspondent, partly because he adored language. And there is sometimes tremendous eloquence, sometimes a slightly sort of irritating obsessiveness with wordplay. This might be one of those examples, but it's kind of fun to see it. He was escaping from Tanglewood. And he was particularly escaping from Kiki Speyer, who had a thing for him at the time. And he was escaping down to Key West, where he composed two of his first important pieces. One of them, you know, I'm sure very well, the Clarinet Sonata, and one of them, I'm equally sure you don't know at all, unless you've dug it out, and that's a ballet called Conchtown, but you'll certainly know the music from it, because one of the tunes that Bernstein composed in 1941 goes bum 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 bum. Okay, this was a piece that he, after Fancy Free, which uses large chunks of it as well, he simply couldn't have finished and produced this piece because he was harvesting it mercilessly for the next 20 years. It's a good piece. But, we get all of this stuff about, I hope the Tanglewood evils have blown over and all is in clover. 'Twas also freaky with Kiki and also bleaky and cheeky. I'll write you again, it goes on, I'll write you again with a better pen. The train sways madly, so I write so badly. My love to Ray, that's her mum, and all the rest. I'm on my way to Old Key West, need I go on? Anyway, you get quite a few letters like that, and there is a sort of certain charm about them. However, Shirley Gabis was another one of Lenny's most honest friends and critics. And when she first heard the Clarinet Sonata, she wrote him a really, really tough letter where she said, now listen, Bernstein, if you're going to start taking yourself seriously as a composer, you've got to start making the effort to stop sounding like Hindemith or Copland or Mio or Bartók, and you've actually got to sound like Bernstein. And for that, you're going to have to dig a lot deeper than you did in this piece. It's a really tough letter. And she said to me when I wrote her about it, asking if I could use it, she said, of course you can, and I should also tell you that about 3 weeks after sending that letter, I got to give the Philadelphia premiere of it, which was a kind of, fate getting its own back on her. But she was very tough in terms of how she thought his musical language was developing, and she wasn't the only one, as we shall see. This is yet another Copland letter. I've illustrated quite a few of them, partly because they're always addressed to someone different. In this case, it's Aaron Liebchen. And he's trying to persuade Copland to come up to Boston. As you can see, this is when he was living briefly in Boston, trying to run a music studio, which seems to have had next to no pupils, but anyway. He was obviously putting on a few concerts, one of which involved Quiet City. And you can see him talking about coming up to hear Quiet City and the Harris Third Symphony, which, as we know, became a great Lenny House specialty in later years. And then says, I never thought it possible to miss one person so thoroughly as I have you, which is very touching, I think. Now then, this is fun. These Oppenheim letters were a complete revelation, and as you can see, the one on the left is the very first letter that Lenny wrote David Oppenheim, who had obviously promised to write. And as you can see, it is 3 words, are you dead? And this is not the way their correspondence went on the whole. It was not usually quite as abbreviated as that. And it did actually elicit a response fairly quickly. These two became incredibly close, incredibly fast. And they were certainly, lovers in 1943. And of course, they both had incredibly distinguished subsequent careers. David Oppenheim, perhaps a word or two about David Oppenheim, because he's a less well-known name. He was a clarinetist, but he then started working for Columbia Records as a producer, moved into TV, worked as a documentary producer, and then became chair of the Tisch School of Arts at NYU. So he had a very, very distinguished career and a very varied one. These Oppenheim letters, the one on the right of the screen is, I think, the second one. And it talks about the fact that Oppenheim was dreading, as was Bernstein for some time, the draft. In Oppenheim's case, he didn't get out of it. He couldn't get out of it. So that's what Draftuary the First is all about. Now, I wanted to show you this one on the left to give you an idea of how this was occasionally a intriguingly challenging task, editing these letters, because just sometimes they are devilishly difficult to read. And this one to Oppenheim, I think, is one such in places. But it's a wonderful letter, and it's fixing up the first performance of the Clarinet Sonata in New York. It had been played in Boston, but not by Oppenheim. By the time it acquired a dedication, as you can see on the right, that was to David Oppenheim. But actually the first person to play it was another wonderful clarinetist, David Glaser. It appears, says Lenny, that WNYC wants the Clarinet Sonata on their Festival of American Music sometime between the 12th and the 22nd of February. Could you possibly do it via a Lincoln's birthday week or some such device? Probably not, but I'd love it if you could, needless to say. Otherwise, I shall have to get an NY guy, maybe Eric Simon, with whom I'm rehearsing these days. Even he would be second choice, obviously. You're the top 5/8 man in these parts, and you know it. You know the second movement of the sonata. In the latter regrettable case, you'll have to send the score so that it can be used or copied and more scores made. Depending in turn on when you plan to do it in Rochester, if you still do. Do you? You see, I tend to lose track of your vibrations when you don't write. And if you can't write, as you put it, at least write saying you can't write. And so on. Of course he came down, and of course he played it. And as a consequence, annoyed at least one person in the form of Aaron Copland, who had told Lenny not to perform it because he thought it was too derivative. And as a consequence, Lenny had to sort of confess that he'd snuck it onto this program. Dear A, I haven't heard from you yet, and by all precedents, you don't deserve a letter, but I have some confessing to do, and after all, I can't betray you without letting you know. First, I betrayed you by playing the Clarinet Sonata today at the League concert in the library. Instead of the 6 pieces, that's to say 6 of the 7 anniversaries, excluding the one that's dedicated to Copland, which at that time was a standalone piece. So it was 6 pieces for piano and the Copland dedication that then became the first set of 7 anniversaries. Sorry, that's a bit complicated, but you want to know what these 6 pieces are. Instead of the 6 pieces as you had wished, I felt the need to present my first League composition as a piece in which slightly larger form than just 6 germs for large pieces. And the sonata does approach, at least, a big form. Besides, and this is the real reason, of course, it was more fun than playing alone, and biggest point, it provided a lovely excuse for having D.O. come down. That's David Oppenheim, of course. So you'll forgive me, won't you? Amusing part, of course, is the great secret twixt Marion Bauer and me, since neither she nor any committee ever saw the sonata first. But she trusted me, and it turned out, it turned out, and liked it, and didn't think the first movement was Hindemith at all, which Copland had been going on and on about, and which, bluntly, any of us who knows the Clarinet Sonata are likely to find ourselves siding with Copland. It's a beautiful movement, but it really does sound like a brilliant Hindemith pastiche. Very soon after these kind of rather post-studenty things, he was suddenly in what became the big time, composing a new ballet. There's a whole long story behind that, which I don't want to bore you with, but one of the really fascinating things about Fancy Free is that it was conceived by 2 people who were hardly ever in New York at the time. This is very useful for us, because the only way they could do a lot of their communication about this ballet was through correspondence. Now, there's one real sadness involved in this, which is that Helen Coates started working as Lenny's secretary just a few months after this letter, which is early 1944. So we don't have, presumably because Bernstein was constantly moving apartments at the time, we don't have Robbins's letters to Bernstein. Hopefully, they'll turn up stashed inside a score or something one day, but we don't have them at the moment. What we do have is Bernstein's letters to Jerry Robbins, and they are full of the most wonderful kind of geeky level of compositional detail, as you can see from the little extract I've put up on the screen. Number 8, on Variation 2, which turned out very pretty and, as Aaron says, dancey. Aaron, by the way, was following every step of the way with this piece, and he and Bernstein recorded little demo recordings of the dances on 2 pianos of Fancy Free. Very wonderful they are too. Excuse me. Dancey. The feeling is mostly sweet plus cocky. Your idea, I think. And change the last chord. It's too sour. The left hand should be that rather than that. You can see that. The chord represents a sort of ballet-ish bow, or male equivalent of curtsy, and so on and so forth. Now, these are very, very long letters about the nuts and bolts of writing a ballet basically between train stations and airports, because they were both touring all over the place. Lenny was just at the very start of his career, conducting in all sorts of unlikely places, and Robbins the same. I think Bernstein was in Canada for some of the time. Now, of course, his other great mentor, who we haven't mentioned at all yet, alongside Copland, was Serge Koussevitzky. And here is a really smashing letter to Koussevitzky, sending with love and deepest congratulations a few notes on your birthday. There they are. And what that is, 5 years before the piece was finished, is essentially the opening of the Age of Anxiety Symphony, which of course was written for Koussevitzky and the Boston Symphony. And here is the opening of it, slightly differently written out, but it's basically the same notes. And he had that in his head as a Koussevitzky birthday piece 5 years before he produced most of the work. Well, most of it was done in 1948. And here is a charming example. Some of the letters do this. Not many have huge, great chunks of music in them, but that one is a rather sweet example, especially given to whom it's written and what it is that it turned into, which was the Koussevitzky piece, if you like. Love that picture. Mostly he hand-wrote his letters, but he was rather fond of his portable typewriter, and we'll be seeing an example of what that could produce in a little while. Yes. Don't you just hate airmail letter, writing paper, especially when you use a fountain pen on it? But this is a wonderful, wonderful letter. And the reason it's such a wonderful letter is because it's one of the first in which Bernstein describes to somebody he's very fond of the scene that he was experiencing when he visited places abroad. Later on, the person who got the most of these brilliant letters was Felicia, once they were married. But in this case, in 1946, he's in Prague, and he describes his impressions of being in Prague in 1946. I think this is marvelous. Dear Helen, things are beginning to pick up, thank God. So far, all the wonderful things Europe holds have offered themselves to me as dim visions, due to the fact that I caught a monstrous cold in Paris on my very first day there, and it's still with me. I've had horrible stiff muscles and aches and sinus blow-ups, but now it begins to abate, and I'm beginning to be able to receive all this fabulous wonder. This is the greatest day in Czech history. As you remember 1 year ago on May 5th, with Patton's army 20 miles away and the Russians at the east door, the people of Prague made a revolution against the Nazis. They just couldn't wait. The next day, they were liberated by the Red Army. So this whole week is festival, the first anniversary of liberty. And are they celebrating, as no American would ever dare to do? Outside in the streets, the whole town is dancing to mic'd-up records of boogie-woogie and Strauss waltzes. People have come from all the provinces, Moravia, Slovakia, in their heavenly national peasant costumes, and the gaiety is beyond description. So he goes on. Now, he was going around several European cities at the time, and one that particularly amuses me, for obvious reasons, was London. And really, it was not a town that set him alight in 1946. He writes to David Oppenheim as the royal husbandman, builder of the house, decorator of the interior, because Oppenheim was fixing up his apartment at the time. Defender of the faith, greeting. This is the dullest yet. Of course, I hit Victory Day again with parades, illuminations, fireworks to us, and 10 million mad folk releasing their repressions in a frightfully gay holiday. Now it's over, and it's still dull. Crowds hanging around Buckingham Palace waiting for royalty to appear. The sun came out for 20 minutes today, and everyone's grateful. Tell me about it. I'm not happy. The programs are a mess, and there's nothing I can do to change them. I'm tired, usually depressed, and have little, if any, clarity of mind. I sleep when I have nothing pressing and try to ignore the dreariness of this hotel and all of London. Oh dear. Happily, it ended a lot better than it began in London. I had to show you this photo because it's from a fantastic collection here in the library of photos of all sorts of people taken by a man called William P. Gottlieb. And Gottlieb, to any author, is a man whose generosity seems completely heavenly, because all of his photos, including incredibly high-resolution downloadable versions of them, are in the public domain, and they're beautiful pictures. There are lots and lots and lots of Bernstein at home in 1946, and also a great series of him conducting a rehearsal at the same time. I think it's about October 1946. Ah, yes. Now, with Koussevitzky, everything seemed to be going so well. And he was getting, Bernstein was getting some very nice work with the Boston Symphony, entirely thanks to Koussevitzky. But then he dared to suggest that he program one of his own works, in this case, Facsimile. And this was what Koussevitzky said. We'll come to Lenny's reply in a minute. Dear Leonard, I can't do a Koussevitzky accent. I so wish I could. So anyway, it'll come in unbroken English. Dear Leonard, my last talk over the telephone with you left a very disturbing impression, and these are the reasons. Speaking of your programs, you stubbornly insisted on the performance of your own composition, even for the broadcast. Do you realize that you're invited as a guest conductor to show your capacity as interpreter of great musical works? As interpreter of great musical works, may I ask you, do you think that your composition is worthy of the Boston Symphony Orchestra and the Boston Organization? Can it be placed on the same level as, wait for this, Beethoven, Schubert, Brahms, Stravinsky, Prokofiev, Bartok, or Copland? You may answer my question saying that I often perform also works of lesser value and scope. But you must not forget that I am the permanent conductor, that I stand at the head of this organization to further and develop the musical culture of this country, and therefore have the obligation to help young composers. Thus, my responsibilities are very different from yours or other guest conductors. Well, Bernstein was devastated by this. I mean, you would be, wouldn't you? And his reply, of course, begins by saying, I've been deeply grieved all day on account of your last letter, as well he might be, actually. I immediately sent you a telegram trying to explain the misunderstanding. But I cancelled it, realizing that it was not a thorough clarification. I must write you instead. And there he is writing at enormous kind of... The correspondence with Koussevitzky had been very, very respectful. Almost overly so. And he really was devastated by this because apart from anything else, Koussevitzky was doing an enormous amount to help Bernstein's career. And he really didn't want to put that in peril. This letter is fascinating, though, for the one thing it doesn't say. For that, we need to go on to the next one, where he remembered that in my excitement about answering your last letter, I completely forgot to tell you that I've become engaged. Big news. This was the first time he got engaged to Felicia. I won't go into the complications of this. You can read all about it. But he was engaged to her, then unengaged, and then re-engaged, and then finally, 4 years after this, married. But it was a long and rather tortured route, which we'll ignore for the purposes of today. Now, here's a great Copland letter, or rather letter to Copland. Yet another form of address, old charmer. It's done. This being the European premiere of Copland's Third Symphony, which Lenny did in Prague with the Czech Philharmonic Orchestra at the Prague Spring Festival. And he begins by saying it's a wonderful work. Fine. He goes on to say that some people don't like it. William Walton is mentioned in the little bit added at the side. Not up my street, said wee Willie Walton. Too eclectic, said Shostakovich, he should talk. I'm glad Lenny added that bit. It lacks a real adagio, said Raphael Kubelik. And everyone found Tchaikovsky's Fifth in it, which only proves their inanity. Well, fair enough. But what's fun is that Bernstein then goes on to tell Copland that he thinks there are rather big problems with this piece too. He quotes, that little quotation is from the slow movement, of course, which by the way, is my favorite part. That's the real inspiration, the real Ehrenchen. I could make out fine anti-cases for movements 1, 2, and of course 4. Oh dear. He's being remarkably blunt about this, and of course, I mean, in my experience, no one gave performances of Copland's Third as powerful as Bernstein's. But the fact that at the very first time he played it, he had these enormous doubts about the sort of structural integrity of the piece, I find fascinating. And even more so that he took the trouble to share these with the composer. There you go. Now, one of the 10,000 Intimate Friends, who was one of the great, great mysteries of this book, was somebody who wrote a fantastically interesting letter to Bernstein in 1947 saying, I've just sent you in the mail a new collection of poetry which I think you might find interesting, Auden's Age of Anxiety. What's more, I think it'd make a really strong basis for a piece of music. You could, in fact, turn it into a kind of symphony. And then in a subsequent letter, he said you could actually also turn it into a ballet, but I wouldn't do that until it's been performed in the concert hall. Those of you who know the performance history of Age of Anxiety will know that this is an uncanny description of what actually happened, because Jerome Robbins' choreographed version opened on stage just very, very shortly, days after the New York premiere of the symphony with the New York Philharmonic and Lucas Foss playing the piano part miraculously. We know how miraculously, because the first recording was made at that time, and that live performance has now been released as well. Anyhow, this letter had a deeply baffling signature that could have been all sorts of things. It looked as if it might have been Jurig, or it was a very, very hard thing to read. Mark and me and several other people agonized over this, looking at this wretched thing, thinking, what is this man's name? Because this letter was so interesting. Anyway, I finally, in a moment of what I thought was actual madness, said, it can't possibly be Twig, can it? And then I dug around a bit. This is one of the great fun things about editing this collection, because nobody had the first idea who Twig was at this point. And then I discovered that there was a Twig, actually Richard, Twig to his friends, who corresponded with quite a few interesting people, and that there was a uncatalogued but mentioned folder of correspondence from Lenny to Twig in a box somewhere up in Yale. And lo, we discovered who Twig Romney, for it is he, no relation, actually possibly a distant relation, but anyway. Twig Romney, who was a real estate person, but who for a time ran an art gallery and who was very, very arty and very well connected with artists and musicians and good friends with them. Anyway, it was he who had made this extraordinary suggestion, not in one letter, but in two, and Bernstein had, for a couple of years, quite a fun correspondence with him. I love this one. It's written from the Netherlands, and he'd been all over Europe. Well, it's over. The big swing around this beautiful, messy continent is at an end, and I'm swollen with success, lush with living, loving, and learning. Germany and Austria were fabulous, filthy, Nazi, exciting. Budapest was grim and gay. Milano was the greatest. Paris, a joy as ever, and Holland, a comfort, where I've soaked up milk and lobsters and sun and been horseback riding every day. I'm happy and a little bit drunk to celebrate the end of the tour. I don't lift an arm until July 1st, and so on. Lovely stuff. Interestingly, in 1950, when the LP of remember those, of Age of Anxiety came out, he sent a copy to Twig Romney saying, here's a new piece, I hope you like what I've done with the poem. And that's the only time he ever mentioned any possible connection between this guy who came up with the idea in the first place and that remarkable correspondence they'd had 3 years earlier. It's unlikely that he'd forgotten all about it, I think, but there we are. Now then, this one's a gem. This is an illustrated letter, illustrated by Yossi Stern, Israeli artist, and it's a letter from Bernstein to his mum, to Jenny Bernstein. Of course, confusingly, it mentions another Jenny on one of the pages I've illustrated there. Jenny Turrell, that is, sang like an angel. The audience, look at them. All these wonderful creatures. This is just the most charming illustration. It's one of my favorite moments working on this book was being when Mark unearthed this letter, which incidentally isn't among letters, it's among writings, just to make life really confusing. And that's a whole other load of stuff. But this letter is not just illustrated on that page, it's illustrated on virtually every page. And it's all right over there, so you can see this marvelous thing for real. It's from Israel at an incredibly difficult time in the autumn of 1948, when the country was firmly at war. There, he and Jenny Turrell are camel riding. It's wonderful stuff. The letter's fabulous. The illustrations, I think, are just adorable. Let's get to something a bit more serious. Here is one of the letters from Bernstein to his sister Shirley. And this one has got some really dark stuff in it. And not perhaps the dark stuff you might expect. This is 16th of May, 1951. He's been talking about a friend of his down in Mexico who had been having a dreadful time being investigated for un-Americanism. It's a mess, and I'm very sorry for him. It can also happen to all of us. So we had better start preparing our blazing orations now. And goes on to say, in a moment of incredible honesty, I hope I'm as brave as I sound from this distance when it catches up with me. In a weird way, it did catch up with him, not called to a HUAC hearing, but almost a more cunning way of getting at Lenny than that, which was that the State Department refused to renew his passport in 1953 until he had signed a 12-page affidavit swearing that he'd never been a member of the Communist Party and so on and so forth, and listing in incredible detail any and all associations that he had with organizations that were at the time considered suspect. So it did get to him, and he did indeed describe it. But before we get to that, I want to show you a fun letter, because this is the only letter I've ever seen from anyone that includes the line, not once but twice, "We went lion hunting." This one is a joy. It's to his brother. Now, the letters to his brother tend to have a kind of humorousness and lightness and kind of slightly boyish humor that's absolutely charming. Every turn on this ranch makes us think of you. We almost thought of going up to Sheridan, but this took precedence, and it beats everything. We've been here 2 days and have to leave today and hate to. Such beauty and luxury. And the Knoxes, the owners of the ranch, are real pals. Every day, because this has just happened, marriage gets better. It may take a lot of days, but I think the big crisis is over. That took place in Detroit, but Phil and Barbara Marcuse were so great, as you know, and really helped enormously. Now get this, last night we went lion hunting. And he then goes on to describe this somewhat bizarre experience. I'm very happy to report they had no luck at all. But they were chasing around in a jeep, drinking whiskey and having a good time. I'm very glad to say they didn't get one. This marriage that was getting better every day, and heaven knows it sounds as if it needed to, was something that Felicia Bernstein also was very sensitive to. And this is one of the most marvelous letters in the book. It's a letter from her. It's a very long one. It's over in Mark's wonderful display. But here she is saying, we're not committed to a life sentence. Nothing is really irrevocable, not even marriage, though I used to think so. Second, you're a homosexual and may never change. You don't admit to the possibility of a double life, but if your peace of mind, your health, your whole nervous system depend on a certain sexual pattern, what can you do? Third, I'm willing to accept you as you are without being a martyr, actually she then goes on to say, on the altar of LB. Well, whether she was or wasn't to some extent that martyr, the staggering eloquence and honesty of this letter I find terribly moving. But she was under no illusions, is the important thing to realize. What changed marriage for Lenny was when children started to appear. Here he is writing to Solomon Braslavsky, who was the music director of the synagogue in Boston, to which he'd been going as a kid. And he writes about this baby who is beautiful beyond words. Her English name is Jamie. And the mother is just as beautiful. And I think it was parenthood. Bernstein, I think, loved being the proudest dad, on earth. And whether he was actually at home or not. What you get here is a sort of complete change in his attitude to what marriage was like. Suddenly it stopped being a kind of slightly worrying social experiment and became a real joy, at least for quite a lot of years. Back to that awful moment with the State Department. 2 letters here, one after the other, written on the same day, both written on August 17th. One to his brother, where he talks about this. Remember, at the top of the second page, remember our rehearsed Washington investigation in the Napoleon Bar in Boston? Well, it came true. Not a subpoena, but since my passport was not to be seen, I finally went down to Washington and had to have a hearing with an ape at the State Department and got it. The great experience of it all was my lawyer, whom I was insanely lucky to get, Jim McInerney, a Kennedy family lawyer. Formerly head of criminal investigation in the Department of Justice, an old commie chaser, and so on. And then, the same day he wrote to David Diamond along exactly the same lines. Now, his correspondence with Diamond was extremely up and down, shall we say, but this one's fascinating, and in this he describes it as one of the most humiliating experiences of his life. One can easily understand why. It was not something he referred to very often. It's a testament to just how close a friend Diamond was at the time, that he was one of really only 2 or 3 people who got a letter about this. I mentioned that in letters to Felicia, he was often very full of the joys of where he was staying. He wrote some marvelously evocative letters. This is one I'll just say, just a quickie, darling, just a quickie. We've arrived into a glorious kind of Pacific autumn here with marvelous light over the Sound, snow-capped peaks all around, and really cool air. I'm ensconced in this palatial suite at the university where it is said Queen Elizabeth was impregnated. Nearly, but not quite. It's a couple of weeks out, but it's a nice try. And here's another one to Felicia from Japan, written just a year or so later. Darling, how can I describe the last 2 days? Paradise, at last, really Japan. Once we got out of mad gay Tokyo, about 16 of us were put up at that famous Japanese inn, where I think I had the most beautiful day and night anyone ever had. The gardens, the beauty, the sea, the quiet, the deep charm, and so on and so forth. You get the idea. They're really quite poetic sort of letters, as opposed to this kind of thing. Joe Roddy, journalist and great friend of Bernstein, who lent him $100 at the expo, at the exposition, World's Fair. And this was the reply. Dearest Joe, why, you will ask yourself, $112.49. Precise figures follow, and indeed they do. And he ends with a little poem. Now that you know that I've eaten crow over the dough you lent at Expo, never go away no more. You can read it for yourself, yes. Sometimes these short letters are much more deep, actually, and charming. This one, to Sondheim, shows you the tritone E-flat A inside a heart, which is very significant because, as he says, it comes with warmest memories of work and play and friendship. S-L, of course, that's the German spelling of S, E-flat, and La, L, A. So it's got every trick in the book about it, this. On your glorious 50th birthday. And of course, it's the interval, the musical interval that Bernstein always talked about, dominating West Side Story, which was their collaboration together 25 years before this letter came out. Similarly, here he is writing to the man who made his batons, Dick Horowitz, legendary timpanist of the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra, and dear friend and cherished colleague Dick, bless you for each and every stick. Here he is writing to Sondheim and having to eat a bit of humble pie. It's particularly hard to apologize to today's Pulitzer winner for a bit of thoughtlessness. Indeed. This was because on the recording that Lenny conducted of West Side Story, he put back in a little bit of the Jet song, and that normally just gets used in the music for the gym. And Sondheim wrote a sweet thank you note for the LP and then said, but I wish you hadn't used that. And this was Lenny's somewhat humble reply. I'm sorry, but also forgive me, singing and leaping about in celebration of your new glory. And does your show deserve it? Well, yes. And there is a thing for Helen Coates' birthday, a quotation from Haydn's Creation. The heavens are telling the glory of God became the heavens are telling the glory of Helen. And you can see a little quote from it. As you can see, these later letters tended to get shorter, but I want to finish with one that is quite extended and quite fascinating because it's to the great poet Yevtushenko. And what you get here is Bernstein setting out quite a detailed idea for a musical collaboration together, and in fact says what would work best of all is if we conceive this as an animated movie, but a kind of animated opera. It's an amazing concept, and it's a long and extraordinary letter, and those of you, and I know a lot of you do, who know Bernstein's correspondence quite well, this letter is quite surprising for one sent so late because it's so long and so detailed and so grappling with an exciting project. And there it is. If only something had ever come of it, but no more came of this than came of the idea Francis Ford Coppola had of making a filmed opera with music by Lenny and lyrics by Compton and Green and choreography by Jerry Robbins and all the rest of it. There are some projects. One of the things these letters show you, among many others, is there were quite a lot of projects that would have been really quite something, if only. And finally, one of the things that comes through is a certain, as well as enormous, endless joy in music, he's very realistic about the fact that as one of the world's busiest conductors, he was never really going to have time to compose. And sometimes that frustration boils over, and you get very, very honest letters saying, I'm never going to make it as a proper composer if I don't stop conducting. And he sometimes sort of berates himself and thinks that that's exactly what he should do. But of course, composing is something you do on your own. And as he said way back in 1939 to one of his college roommates, the one thing he could never, ever bear to be without was the company of others, whether actually in the room or through his extraordinary, rich, vibrant, funny, and touching correspondence. Thank you so much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.